Ah, you're still awake. Okay, well let's keep powering through this. I'll keep this introduction short because in this lesson, what we're going to be doing is looking at all of the settings in the Oxygen panel. So let's not waste any more time on this intro and let's get stuck into it. What we're looking at here is the Oxygen panel inside WordPress. So this is the home screen and it's really just a dashboard, and like most dashboards, it's a little bit redundant. It just takes you to places that you're going to get to anyway. For example, this is for adding new pages, this is for adding new templates, and there's some information about accessing the design libraries, as well as getting on their Facebook pages, etc. Now, if you've ever created a blank install and you want to get back into Oxygen to add a new design library, you can do that here. So you can actually add a design library after you've done a blank install, if for some reason you want to do that. Moving down the list, we have templates. When you come into templates, you'll notice that it actually has a very similar layout to pages and posts. And that's essentially the first step in creating a page or a post. It's the same in templates. You create a new template, you give it a title, and then you save it. I'm not going to go through all of the details in templates because I have a dedicated lesson for that in this module. So let's keep going and we'll skip on to the next one. The block library is almost identical to the templates. The only difference with the block library here is that anything you create and save becomes a custom Gutenberg block. So you don't assign templates or usable parts in here, you're actually creating a custom Gutenberg block every time you use this area. Export and import settings. When a site is created, you can actually export all of the code here and paste it into a new build on Oxygen. Or alternatively, you can paste in code and import this. There is a setting here if you want to import the global colors. So in Oxygen, there are some global settings like colors and fonts, but it has a warning here because if you click this, it will overwrite any of the work that you've done as far as the global colors. So just be warned with that. Lastly, we have this sections panel. Now this is fairly detailed, so we're going to go through this step by step. So the settings area in Oxygen is fairly large and there's a few tabs to go through. So let's just keep working through them. The first thing you'll see at the top here is the history limit. This is essentially how many undos you have. If you make a mistake in Oxygen, you can undo that and undo that change, and it has a limit of 50, which is pretty fair. So I'd leave it at 50. Again, you've got a preview limit here. I leave this as the default, but what this does is limit the amount of pages that you can select to preview from in the drop-down. And by that, what I mean is when you're creating a template, just like how we created the page with the lorem ipsum for the about page, in Oxygen, you can actually preview those pages and the content live within the template. So this just limits how many will be in that drop-down. You can leave that as default. Again, this is a similar thing. This actually excludes the non-public post types from those previews if you've got like a custom post type, for example. The next thing here is we've got enable selector detector. This is actually pretty cool. If you've got something like a form, for example, that isn't a part of Oxygen, if you turn selector detector on, you're able to select specific parts of that, like the form fields or the labels, and then style them directly using Oxygen's theming options. The next thing here, we've got Google Maps API key. Oxygen works without using a Google Maps API key anyway. You can still use the Google Maps, but if you want, you can paste your Google Maps API key in here. Now we definitely want to have show all ACF fields in the dynamic data dialog. This is actually just how you get to the ACF fields, so we want to leave that installed. All right, the next thing here, we've got cache the Google fonts. This is for the back end. We do want to cache these, it just makes them quicker and easier to get to. So let's leave that. And lastly, who's not going to have enabled layout improvements for IE10? It just makes sense. Let's move on to client control. In this tab, what we're doing here is actually limiting people's access to Oxygen itself. Now we saw before when we're looking at the pages that there's a big box that shows for editing or entering Oxygen. You can actually turn this off so the client never knows that Oxygen is installed at all. You can do this by subscriber type or role type, or you can do this per user. So if someone is an admin, for example, you could still add them and select the user and give them no access. You You can also say what type of access you want them to have it to. So you could turn off this for, say, posts and pages, but then allow it in different areas if you want to. Moving on to security. Now, shortcodes are something that often need to be reassigned in Oxygen. You'll see things like when you migrate a site or something goes wrong, and it's really common for people to say you need to assign or reassign the shortcodes. Now, how you do that is you go in here and you say assign all shortcodes. It will ask you if you've made a complete backup, and then the type of shortcodes that are going to be reassigned, select them, and then go start the shortcode assigning process. Now, I've only got a couple of pages, so you'll see that was pretty quick and painless. But if you have a lot of stuff, then it'll be a little bit of a longer process. But that actually is essentially like clearing all of those shortcodes and reassigning them. Let's get back into it. Under SVG sets, Oxygen comes with Font Awesome and linear icons already installed, but you can download other icon sets and upload them here. Typekit, if you're not going to use Google Fonts or upload custom fonts and you want to connect to Typekit, there is some specific instructions here, and all you do is paste in your API key and get going. Fairly self-explanatory here. This is where you put in your Oxygen license, also your Gutenberg and your Composite Elements license, CSS cache. So Oxygen has its internal cache. You'll probably leave this on, and from time to time, Oxygen will warn you if you've changed something like a global style, and what it's trying to tell you is that the front end and the back end won't be showing the same CSS. So it'll tell you to come here and click regenerate. It's pretty simple. All you do is click regenerate and it'll go through and say all done when it's completed the process. Bloat Eliminator. So there's a few things in here, and again, the default stuff is pretty much what you want. You've got here disabling WP emojis. Now, I don't know many situations where I would be using emojis on my website, so I'm going to turn that off, and it is off by default. This here, disable jQuery migrate, actually stops you from being able to have multiple versions of jQuery running at once. So again, keep that selected. Disable embeds. So if you don't want to have clients, for example, pasting in YouTube videos and having them automatically embed like you can do with Gutenberg, then turn this off. Now you can disable Google Fonts, and this is a great idea if you're using custom fonts or you're using the Typekit fonts. Turn that off if you're not using those. Lastly, we have disable WebFont.js. This actually uses CSS for Google Fonts instead of WebFont.js, and it gives better performance, so just leave that one ticked. This is the library panel, and this is where you can control design sets. And by design sets, there's actually three to think about. There's the default Oxygen design sets. You can turn this off so there's no actual access to these if you want to. Now you can actually enable third-party design sets and install design sets from other people. You can also turn your own Oxygen website into a design set itself. That's right, you can create your own design sets, share them with yourself, and even on-sell them. Now, if you make this install a design set, you'll have your own site key, and then you want to generate screenshots for those screens, and then you can actually start to share this and sell this if you really want to. Lastly, we have the Gutenberg tab. Now, this is essentially just the labels for the categories and the types of blocks you're creating in Oxygen and how they will show up in the Gutenberg editor. So that means that you can customize this. So you might give it your own name. You might call this Corey.blocks. You might call it something else. You might also give it the same name as the client if you want. It's just a nicer way to have custom labels for your Gutenberg blocks that have been created in Oxygen. So there you go. That was probably the most boring stuff that I have to show you. So if you're still hanging in there, that's great. I'm really, really happy. You should have a good idea now of all of those settings, and you should see that most of the time you're going to leave this stuff fairly vanilla. So you know what to do. Click the complete lesson and it's up there, and I'll see you in the next one.